In the late summer of 1984, in the quiet town of Amstetten in Lower Austria, an 18-year-old woman stepped into the cellar of her family home and was never seen again. Yet beneath the surface of this ordinary setting lay a contradiction that no one could reconcile. A disappearance without movement, witnesses, or direction. How could a person vanish inside the very place where she lived her entire life? And from that moment onward, why did no trace of her ever emerge again? The Fritzl household was one of those families. Joseph, a disciplined electrical technician, maintained firm control over how the home functioned, while his wife, Rosemarie, kept the daily schedule running without interruption. Their fourth child, 18-year-old Elizabeth, had reached an age where she hoped for more independence, but she remained respectful and reserved in her behavior. She helped with housework, rarely socialized beyond a few school friends, and often withdrew from disagreements to avoid conflict. Although she had once stayed away from home longer than expected, an incident that led to her being brought back by police, she had remained stable in the months leading up to August 1984, giving no sign of planning another departure. During those same years, Joseph spent a significant amount of time in the basement, expanding a storage area into a reinforced structure. He explained to authorities that it was a protective space, a type of shelter that was not uncommon during that period. The construction was slow but steady. Bags of cement, steel panels, and tools moved in and out of the property without attracting much attention from neighbors who viewed him simply as a man dedicated to ambitious home projects. He rarely allowed others into the basement, but no one questioned his preference to work alone. On the afternoon of August 28, 1984, the family routine appeared normal. Elizabeth had completed her tasks for the day and was expected to help prepare the evening meal later. Joseph approached her shortly after 3 p.m. and asked for assistance with fitting a heavy door in the newly built section of the cellar. She had helped him before, and there was nothing unusual in the request. According to statements gathered years later, she followed him downstairs into the low, unfinished corridor where tools and materials were kept. It was the last confirmed moment anyone outside that basement would see her. When dinner time approached, Rosemarie noticed Elizabeth had not returned to the kitchen. She assumed at first that her daughter was finishing a task downstairs or had stepped into the garden. Joseph told the children that she might have gone out for a short walk, a habit she occasionally followed to clear her mind. As the evening continued and she did not reappear, her mother checked her room but found everything in place. Bed unmade, clothes folded, no note left behind. The absence grew more concerning when younger siblings said they had not seen her outside, either. By late evening, the family began to search around the property. Rosemarie walked to the corner of the street, looked toward the nearest bus stop, and asked a neighbor whether Elizabeth had been seen that afternoon. No one had noticed her passing by. Joseph kept his answers short when questioned by his wife, saying only that he had asked Elizabeth to help him with a repair, but did not see where she went afterward. The house became tense as midnight approached. It was unlike Elizabeth to leave without saying where she was going, especially considering past conflicts that had made her mother more attentive to her movements. The next morning, her absence became more alarming. Her bed remained untouched from the night before, and there were no signs that she had taken any clothes, money, or personal belongings. Rosemarie searched the yard and shed, while Joseph left briefly by car, returning an hour later without explanation. He then suggested that Elizabeth might have left by choice, but his tone remained restrained, giving little detail. Her mother, unsettled by the lack of certainty, contacted relatives to ask whether Elizabeth had visited them. None had heard from her. During the following day, the family expanded their search to the areas Elizabeth sometimes walked through: small paths behind the house, the nearby riverbank, and the footpath leading toward town. There was no trace. Joseph drove to the police station, stating that Elizabeth might have gone away voluntarily. He referred to the earlier incident years before, implying that she could have repeated that behavior. The officer receiving the report noted her age, her past attempt to leave, and the lack of evidence suggesting immediate danger. A missing person entry was filed according to routine procedure, but no urgent dispatch was created, as nothing indicated the involvement of crime at that point. Back at home, Rosemary continued to question neighbors. One recalled seeing Joseph working in the yard earlier that afternoon, but had not seen Elizabeth. Another described the day as quiet, with no unusual movement around the property. There were no witnesses who could state that she had left the street on foot, nor anyone who saw her at the bus stop. The uncertainty increased the emotional pressure on the family, though the outward response of each member differed. Joseph responded with short, controlled statements. Rosemary oscillated between searching and waiting. The younger children followed instructions without understanding the severity of the situation. By the third day, the family's efforts remained unsuccessful. There were no phone calls, no messages, and no personal belongings missing that might indicate she had left intentionally. Her mother repeatedly checked the door, hoping to hear the sound of footsteps returning. But each check ended the same way. Silence. Police conducted a basic round of inquiries, confirming that there had been no sightings of Elizabeth at local stations, shelters, or community centers during the previous 48 hours. Without evidence to suggest she had traveled far, the situation stayed confined to the immediate surroundings of the Fritzl home. As the first week approached, the family had little more information than they had on the first night. Elizabeth had walked down to the cellar with her father in the late afternoon, and from that moment onward, she was simply gone. No movement in or out of the house had been witnessed. No friend had heard from her. No person in town reported seeing her on the day she disappeared. In the official notes taken during those early days, the last confirmed sighting remained unchanged. August 28, 1984. And in the days following that date, not a single verified encounter with her was recorded anywhere. In the days immediately following Elizabeth's disappearance, the initial concern inside the Fritzl home shifted into a more structured attempt to understand where she might have gone. Her mother moved through the house repeatedly, checking the same corners, opening the same closet doors, and looking out the same windows, hoping for a small sign that had previously been overlooked. Each morning she walked the path from the house to the nearest store, asking anyone she met if they had seen a young woman with long, fair hair passing by. Most replied with uncertainty, explaining that the previous days had been ordinary and that no unfamiliar movement had caught their attention. The absence of any sighting became a detail that weighed heavily on her, because it meant there was no confirmed trace of where Elizabeth could have gone. Joseph maintained a calm tone when speaking with police or neighbors, saying that Elizabeth had been unsettled for years and had mentioned leaving home more than once. He repeated that her earlier attempt to go to Vienna had seemed spontaneous, implying she was capable of acting without warning. This explanation, presented with confidence, shaped the way other people interpreted the situation. To outsiders, the story sounded plausible. An 18-year-old withdrawing from a strict household, leaving with little preparation, perhaps seeking independence. Without clear evidence of harm, this assumption influenced the direction of the first steps taken by police. The officers assigned to the case followed standard procedures. They asked routine questions. When was she last seen? Did she take any belongings? Had she argued with anyone recently? Rosemary answered as best as she could, though much of what she said contrasted with Joseph's statements. She described Elizabeth as quiet in the weeks before her disappearance, not restless, not preparing to leave, not packing any items. The contradictions did not immediately raise suspicion, but the difference in tone, one parent describing uncertainty, the other describing determination, created a file that did not have a single coherent narrative. The police then contacted local bus and train stations. These facilities kept simple notes of passengers who purchased long-distance tickets, and while the system was not precise, it offered clues when individuals traveled suddenly. In Elizabeth's case, there were no records indicating she had boarded any form of public transport on the day she disappeared or the days that followed. Officers also checked nearby shelters and youth facilities, places where young adults sometimes sought temporary refuge. None had registered anyone matching her description. During this time, neighbors began speaking among themselves, comparing small observations from the week she vanished. One woman who lived across the street recalled seeing Joseph carrying tools into the basement, but she could not recall seeing Elizabeth outside at any time that day. Another neighbor mentioned that the house seemed unusually quiet on the evening she disappeared, though he admitted that this might not have been unusual for that household. These conversations circulated, but no detail pointed to a clear direction or provided a reliable starting point for a deeper search. By the fourth day, police returned to the Fritzl home for a second interview. Standard practice required them to revisit the location where the missing person was last seen, in case details had been overlooked or new inconsistencies appeared. Rosemary answered their questions again, describing the moment she realized Elizabeth had not come home for dinner and the steps the family took overnight. She mentioned her increasing fear that something unplanned had happened. Joseph, standing nearby, repeated that he believed Elizabeth had left by choice, stating that she was old enough to do so and insisting that previous attempts should be taken seriously. His certainty contrasted sharply with his wife's doubt, yet the officers noted both accounts without making immediate judgments. Their report focused on measurable facts: age, last sighting, lack of evidence of struggle, and unclear direction of travel. In many missing person cases at that time, the absence of physical evidence often led police to consider voluntary departure as the primary explanation. Elizabeth was legally an adult, had a history of leaving home once before, and left no visible signs of resistance. These elements shaped the early investigative approach. The officers encouraged the family to notify them immediately if any new information surfaced, while they continued to check nearby towns for unreported sightings. Inside the household, tension grew. The younger children asked repeated questions, sensing that the disappearance was not temporary. Rosemary tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but her movements became more repetitive, more uncertain. She checked the front gate many times a day, looked toward the walkway that led from the street, and listened for any familiar sound that might indicate her daughter's return. The silence that greeted her each time only deepened her sense that the situation was drifting further from explanation. Joseph, meanwhile, maintained his steady posture. He told relatives he believed Elizabeth had found people who influenced her the same way they had during her earlier attempt to leave. He repeated that she might have joined a group or organization, though he offered no specific name and described it vaguely as a community she had mentioned before, a statement that his wife did not recall hearing. His calmness, which some interpreted as composure, caused others to accept his version of events more easily than the uncertainties voiced by her mother. This disparity in how each parent processed the situation became a detail later noted by authorities, but at the time, it did not alter the direction of the search. As the 6th and 7th days passed, the case remained without progress. Police did not receive calls from nearby towns, no witness came forward with information, and no personal item of Elizabeth's appeared anywhere. The family continued to search the immediate area, focusing on roadsides, bus stops, and paths leading toward the town center. Each attempt ended the same way, without result. Her name was added to a regional list of individuals who might have left their homes voluntarily, a classification common during that period when young adults occasionally left home without notifying family. In these first days, the absence of any concrete evidence prevented the investigation from advancing beyond its initial stage. There was no sign of a struggle in the home, no report of suspicious activity, and no indication that Elizabeth had contacted anyone before disappearing. The last verifiable moment remained unchanged. She had walked down to the cellar with her father on the afternoon of August 28th, and from that moment forward, nothing placed her anywhere outside that basement or anywhere in the town. Within a single week, her disappearance shifted from an urgent family concern to an unresolved question with no direction, leaving both the household and the authorities without a clear path to follow. In the weeks that followed Elizabeth's disappearance, the atmosphere around the Fritzl home shifted from active searching to a quieter, more uneasy waiting. The earliest days had been filled with repeated checks around the neighborhood, brief conversations with neighbors, and several visits to familiar paths she often used. But as each of these efforts ended without the slightest indication of where she might have gone, the rhythm of both the family and the police began to settle into a pattern shaped mainly by the absence of new information. Within the home, Elizabeth's mother continued to move through the rooms as though one overlooked detail might still be waiting to be found, but every inspection ended in the same way. Nothing was missing, nothing had changed, and nothing pointed to her next steps. Joseph maintained the same explanation he had offered from the beginning. He told neighbors and relatives that Elizabeth had been restless for years, that she had previously left without warning, and that this disappearance fit a pattern he believed she might repeat. Because he spoke confidently and without confusion, his version of events sounded plausible to many who heard it. Several people in their circle recalled her earlier attempt to go to Vienna, and this memory helped reinforce the idea that she might have acted independently again. The absence of visible conflict in the days before she vanished also supported this interpretation. There had been no argument, no raised voices, and no outward sign that something inside the home was about to change. The police, after their initial efforts produced no leads, followed the procedures commonly applied to missing adults at that time. They rechecked transportation hubs, asking whether any staff had noticed a young woman purchasing a ticket or boarding a late bus. None had. They contacted shelters and youth centers where individuals sometimes appeared after leaving home, but no matching name or description had been recorded. Their report for the first month contained only simple notes: last confirmed sighting, no belongings taken, no reports of injury, and no witness placing her beyond the family residence. The absence of suspicious evidence made it difficult for investigators to justify a deeper inquiry. Inside the household, the return to routine was more surface than substance. Rosemary continued to expect a phone call or a letter, holding on to the belief that her daughter would not leave indefinitely without sending some form of reassurance. She checked the front gate often, sometimes stepping outside briefly to look down the street in both directions. Each time, the street remained quiet and unchanged. The children sensed the tension, even if they did not fully understand it, and grew quieter at mealtimes. Joseph remained composed, telling the family that Elizabeth needed time and that she would return when she was ready. His certainty left little room for discussion, and over time, the household grew careful about raising the subject too directly. In the wider community, her disappearance continued to be mentioned for several months, but gradually became a story without new details to share. Some residents believed she had moved to a city. Others suggested that she might have found work somewhere outside Amstetten. A few mentioned the possibility that she had connected with a religious group, a theory repeated by Joseph often enough that it became the most common explanation. But all these ideas rested on speculation rather than evidence. No one in the town had seen her walking away. No one had encountered her in the days before the disappearance, and no personal item of hers had been found anywhere. When 6 months had passed, the police completed a routine review of the file. A note was added indicating that there had been no financial activity under her name, no new employment record, and no registration in another district. At the time, these absences were not considered unusual. It was not uncommon for young adults who left home abruptly to avoid official channels, and many authorities accepted such gaps as consistent with voluntary departure. Without contradictory information, the file remained unchanged. As the second year approached, the family adjusted to a version of daily life that contained an unspoken space where Elizabeth had once been. Her belongings were slowly moved, not removed, but rearranged as practical needs arose. Some items stayed exactly where she had left them, as though her mother wished to preserve the sense that she might walk back into the house unexpectedly. Relatives continued to call during holidays or anniversaries, asking for updates, but as time passed, these conversations became less frequent. Each call followed the same pattern. No new information, no confirmed sighting, and no sign that the situation would change. Outside the home, Elizabeth's disappearance faded into the background of community memory. The absence of developments meant that over time, fewer people brought up her name, and the story became something mentioned only when another missing person case surfaced in the news. To the authorities, her file remained active but dormant. It could not be closed, but it also could not be advanced. A year-end review by the district office added a simple line stating that there was no evidence of criminal involvement, a phrase that did not resolve the case but explained why it did not move forward. Joseph continued to offer the same explanation to anyone who asked. Elizabeth had left because she wanted independence. His presentation of the story never shifted, and his calm tone influenced how others accepted his version. He rarely discussed the subject with unnecessary detail, which in turn made his explanation sound matter-of-fact. Rosemarie, while still waiting for a sign from her daughter, grew quieter when speaking about the disappearance, unsure whether further questions would lead to answers or simply reopen uncertainty. By the end of the second year, nearly every factual point in the investigation remained unchanged from the earliest days. The last verified moment was the afternoon she went into the cellar. No one saw her leave the property. No personal belongings were missing. No argument had occurred. And no resident in the town had encountered her afterward. It was the absence of all these details, not their presence, that caused the case to slip into what investigators referred to as a quiet stage, a phase where there was nothing to pursue but nothing to close. And from that point onward, Elizabeth Fritzl's name remained on official lists as an adult who had left home under uncertain circumstances, with no further information to suggest where she might be. For many years after Elizabeth's disappearance, nothing occurred in Amstetten that suggested her case would ever move beyond the quiet status it had settled into. The file remained stored in the district office, updated only when standard procedures required it, and the brief references made during annual reviews never produced fresh direction. Her name appeared occasionally in paperwork, only to confirm that there were no new sightings, no new registrations, and no recorded activity of any kind. By this time, several members of the police force who had handled the initial search had either retired or moved to other assignments, leaving only the written record to explain what had happened in the late summer of 1984. Without new information, the case stayed still for more than 2 decades. The shift, when it finally came, did not begin with police work, but with a medical emergency involving someone who had no documented connection to the missing woman. In April 2008, long after Elizabeth's name had ceased to circulate in local conversation, Hospital staff in the nearby town were confronted with a young woman brought in during the night in critical condition. She appeared extremely pale, showed signs of severe malnutrition, and had no official medical history on file. The man who brought her in, Josef Fritzl, stated that she was his granddaughter and that she had been left on his doorstep earlier that week by her mother, whom he described as a member of a group that preferred to remain isolated. His explanation was brief and delivered in the same controlled tone he had used decades earlier when reporting Elizabeth missing. He provided as much information as he believed necessary and did so with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to without challenge. The hospital staff, however, reacted differently. The patient's condition suggested years of limited sunlight and irregular nutrition, patterns typically seen in individuals who had lived in isolation for long stretches of time. Her teeth, skin, and posture did not match the profile of a young woman leading a normal life. The absence of vaccination records or school health files added to the uncertainty. When the doctors asked for more information about her background, Joseph repeated his earlier explanation without offering additional clarity. The inconsistency between the girl's physical state and the story given by the man who delivered her raised concern, and by regulation, the hospital contacted the authorities for assistance. When officers arrived, they conducted a basic interview with Josef, who calmly restated his claim that the girl's mother could not be reached due to personal reasons associated with her living situation. His responses were vague, but delivered with an assurance that had historically discouraged further questioning. Yet two details stood out to investigators. The first was the absence of any documented school enrollment or identity record for the girl, something difficult to reconcile with her age. The second was her extreme medical state, which suggested isolation rather than a typical upbringing. These concerns led officers to request that the mother come forward for questioning, not as a suspect, but as someone whose information was urgently needed for the young woman's treatment. Public announcements were made through local media channels, asking the mother, who had not been named, to contact the hospital immediately. The tone of these announcements focused on medical necessity, explaining that accurate information could influence treatment and potentially save the patient's life. For the authorities, it was a straightforward call for cooperation. For Joseph, however, it created a problem that his earlier explanations could not easily address. Unbeknownst to anyone above ground, Elizabeth was alive and had spent the last 24 years in the concealed area beneath the home. In that hidden space, a small television provided the only connection to the outside world. When the broadcast appeared, requesting the mother of the hospitalized girl to come forward, Elizabeth recognized the situation immediately and understood the urgency. Her daughter's survival might depend on information she could provide. According to later statements, she approached her father and insisted that she be allowed to leave the basement to assist her child. This insistence created tension within the concealed rooms because the secrecy surrounding the space had been maintained without exception since 1984. However, Joseph now faced a situation in which the explanation he had relied upon for decades could not satisfy hospital staff or police. For the first time in many years, his control over the situation weakened. He knew that continued refusal to produce the girl's mother would draw more attention, and the medical staff's concerns would escalate further. The pressure from both sides, the hospital seeking answers and Elizabeth demanding to be allowed to help, left him with limited options. At this point, according to later records, Joseph formed an improvised plan to present Elizabeth publicly as someone who had reappeared after years of separation. He drove back to the hospital and informed staff that the family had returned to him unexpectedly, repeating the same narrative of a secluded lifestyle that had influenced his earlier reports. Police officers, already uneasy about the inconsistencies in his statements, requested to speak with the mother directly. Joseph agreed, and arrangements were made. When officers arrived to meet her, they followed standard procedure by separating her from the man who brought her. This single step, taken for routine investigative purposes, became the moment in which the 24-year silence around Elizabeth's disappearance finally broke. Inside the interview room, confronted by authorities and aware that her daughter's condition demanded immediate clarity, Elizabeth stated that she would provide the information they needed, but only under one condition: she would not speak in the presence of her father. This statement, delivered calmly but firmly, marked the first disruption to the story Joseph had maintained for decades. It was the first moment in the entire case when his explanation no longer aligned with the behavior of those involved. The officers, recognizing the significance of her request, agreed to her terms. The interview was postponed until she could speak freely. This delay, combined with the unusual circumstances that had brought her to the hospital, created a sense of hesitation within the investigative team. Something beyond the expected narrative was taking shape, and although they did not yet know what it was, the pattern of the past 24 years was beginning to shift. The hospital, the police, and the district office now found themselves at the threshold of a development that none of their earlier procedures had anticipated. The disappearance that had once settled into silence was beginning to rise again, not through new evidence discovered by investigators, but through the sudden emergence of someone who had been missing for nearly half a lifetime. When Elizabeth was finally brought into a private interview room, away from Joseph, away from the presence that had controlled every aspect of her life for 24 years, her silence at first appeared to be the uncertainty of someone facing an unfamiliar environment. The officers noted her posture, her careful movements, and the way she looked at the door each time it opened. They believed they were about to question a woman who had returned after years living elsewhere, possibly in unconventional circumstances. What they did not expect was a statement that would reshape their understanding of a disappearance they had once considered a closed matter. After allowing her a moment to gather herself, one officer repeated the same request the hospital had made. The medical team needed details about the young woman's health: vaccinations, early childhood conditions, any history that might explain her state. Elizabeth listened quietly. Then, in a steady voice, she asked again whether her father was within hearing distance. Once assured that he was not, she said she would cooperate, but needed protection. The officers recorded her words, still unaware of what she was about to disclose. The account she gave did not begin with the past few weeks, but with the afternoon of August 28, 1984, the very day listed in her original missing person report. She described descending into the cellar to help Joseph with a door and losing consciousness shortly after. At first, the officers assumed she meant she had fainted or suffered an accident. But as she spoke further, a different understanding took shape. Her description of waking in a small room, of not being able to leave, and of having no control over her movements forced the investigators to reconsider everything they believed they knew about her disappearance. She did not describe being influenced or persuaded to join a group. She described being held inside the basement of her family home. At this point, the officers paused the interview, not because they doubted her, but because the information she provided carried implications far beyond anything they had anticipated. A second team was asked to join, bringing a senior investigator to review the recorded statements. The shift in the room was not dramatic, but deliberate. The officers spoke calmly, asking her to repeat certain details only for clarity, not challenge. Her answers remained consistent. She named the location. She described the structure. She mentioned the years. She provided information that no one outside that basement could have known. When asked why she had not contacted anyone, or attempted escape earlier, she explained simply that escape had not been possible, and that opportunities to communicate with the outside world had never existed. The officers continued with caution. They asked about the children. She stated that 3 of them had lived with her in the basement since birth, and that 3 others had been taken upstairs by Joseph years earlier. This detail aligned with information presented by Joseph to child services long before that night, though the officers did not yet understand the connection. They asked about her health and her movements over the years. Her answers suggested a life completely separated from the outside world, restricted by doors she could not open and by rules enforced with absolute control. She recounted the rhythm of the basement, the limited air, the lights that could be turned off from above, the long stretches of time with no sound except those created by the small group of people living below ground. Each sentence she delivered was calm, almost procedural, as though she had rehearsed the account many times privately, but had never spoken it aloud. By the end of the interview, the officers no longer considered the story speculative. They were aware that if her testimony was accurate, the basement of the Fritzl home was not merely a storage space or reinforced shelter, but a location where a person reported missing in 1984 had been confined without detection for more than 2 decades. The implications required immediate action. Without informing Joseph, the police obtained authorization to examine the residence. They proceeded during the night, with hospital staff ensuring Elizabeth remained under observation and away from contact with her father. When the investigative team reached the house, Joseph was still present. He was cooperative, but displayed heightened tension when asked to provide access to the cellar. He attempted to delay entry, referring to the basement as a personal workspace, and insisting that the officers required additional paperwork. The investigators, already aware of inconsistencies revealed in the interview, insisted on immediate access. Within minutes, Joseph's resistance gave way. Officers proceeded through the basement entrance. What they found confirmed Elizabeth's account in every essential detail. There was no sign of a recent disturbance. Instead, the structure bore marks of long-term occupation, rooms connected by narrow corridors, air circulation that appeared improvised, and a layout that did not correspond to any plan Joseph had previously submitted for building approval. In one room, blankets and children's belongings indicated ongoing use. In another, the walls showed signs of moisture that suggested years of limited ventilation. It was not a shelter used occasionally. It was a living space that had been occupied continuously for an extended period of time. The discovery altered the case permanently. Officers secured the area, documenting every room and every object before sealing the basement as a protected scene. Joseph was taken into custody not with dramatic confrontation, but with a brief, formal notification that his presence was required for questioning. He did not resist physically, but the calm he had displayed for decades appeared to fade, replaced by a quiet that investigators had not observed in earlier interviews. At the station, he was asked to explain the basement, the children, the disappearance of Elizabeth, and the contradictions between his earlier statements and the evidence now collected. His answers shifted repeatedly. First, he claimed she had returned only recently. Then he offered a narrative that attempted to diminish responsibility. Eventually, faced with the physical reality the officers had documented, he acknowledged that he had built the rooms intentionally and that Elizabeth had lived in them for many years. His statements were inconsistent and incomplete, but the essential admission was recorded. When the officers reviewed both sets of testimonies, the one given by Elizabeth and the fragmented account offered by Joseph, they recognized that the missing person case from 1984 was no longer simply a disappearance. It had become a case involving long-term confinement, false reporting, and a concealed life beneath a family home. The investigation expanded immediately, drawing in additional units, legal advisors, and medical specialists. The years of silence surrounding Elizabeth's name had ended in a single night, replaced by a set of facts that required careful examination, but were already clear enough to shift the course of the entire case. When the initial interviews concluded, and the basement had been secured as evidence, the case moved from emergency response into formal legal procedure. The authorities now faced a situation far more complex than the reopening of an old missing person file. They had a living witness who had been absent for nearly 24 years, a suspect who had admitted to creating the environment in which she had been confined, and a group of children who had never before been documented by any social or medical institution. This combination of factors required coordination between multiple branches of law enforcement, health services, and judicial authorities, each responsible for a different aspect of the emerging case. The first step, however, was ensuring that Elizabeth and her children were protected from further contact with Joseph. This separation was maintained from the moment she gave her first statement, and it marked a new boundary between the family members, one that would not be crossed again. In the days that followed, investigators built the framework for what would eventually become the formal charges. They conducted detailed examinations of the basement, recording its dimensions, the construction materials, the wiring, and the presence of locks and mechanisms that could be operated from outside the rooms. Every component was documented in a manner that would later be presented in court. Medical professionals examined Elizabeth and the children, and their findings contributed additional layers of evidence, signs of prolonged isolation, restricted sunlight, and limited movement. The combination of physical and testimonial information formed the structure of a case in which each point supported the next, creating a chain of facts that was difficult to dispute. Joseph was questioned repeatedly, but his explanations shifted depending on the angle of the inquiry. In one session, he claimed that Elizabeth had voluntarily retreated into the basement and lived there by choice. In another, he attempted to present himself as a provider for two separate households. But the inconsistencies in his statements became more pronounced as investigators compared them with the physical evidence. The design of the basement, the number of locked barriers, the materials used, and the absence of any independent means of exit did not align with a narrative of voluntary isolation. His earlier reports to police and child services about abandoned infants were also re-examined and contrasted with Elizabeth's testimony, revealing contradictions that undermined the credibility of his version of events. As these inconsistencies accumulated, the prosecution prepared its case. The timeline began with Elizabeth's disappearance in 1984 and extended to the night she reappeared in the hospital in 2008. Each year between those 2 points was represented by physical evidence, statements, or medical findings. The prosecution's emphasis was not on emotional appeal, but on a structured presentation of facts. The intentional construction of the basement, the concealment of its true purpose, the restriction of movement, and the absence of any genuine opportunity for Elizabeth to leave. In parallel with these preparations, arrangements were made for the care of the children, whose medical and psychological needs required immediate and ongoing attention. The courtroom proceedings were scheduled for the following year, allowing time for the legal teams to organize their arguments and for the court to review the extensive documentation. When the trial began, the environment was controlled and formal, with strict adherence to procedure. Elizabeth did not need to appear in person. Her statements, recorded under protective conditions, were submitted as evidence. The court recognized the sensitivity of her circumstances and allowed her testimony to be represented through documents and video recordings rather than direct confrontation. Joseph entered the courtroom under the observation of legal officials, journalists, and representatives from various agencies involved in the case. His demeanor was quieter than during earlier questioning, and he listened as the charges were read aloud. These charges reflected the findings gathered over months of investigation and included unlawful confinement, coercion, and the creation of an environment that placed the health and safety of multiple individuals at risk. The proceedings moved deliberately, with each side presenting information in chronological order, showing how one event led to another across the span of nearly a quarter of a century. The testimony presented by the prosecution was composed of extensive material: diagrams of the basement structure, medical reports detailing the effects of long-term isolation, and transcripts of Elizabeth's interviews. The court also examined documentation related to the earlier reports of children appearing at the Fritzl home in the 1990s. These reports, which had previously been accepted without suspicion, were now understood in a different light. The absence of any witness who had seen the children being left at the property, combined with inconsistencies in Joseph's explanations, strengthened the argument that these accounts had been constructed to conceal the true circumstances in which the children had been born. Through each phase of the trial, the defense attempted to frame Joseph's actions as misguided rather than intentional, suggesting that he had been unable to manage the situation and had acted out of fear rather than malice. But this argument was repeatedly challenged by evidence that illustrated long-term planning rather than impulsive decisions. The design of the basement, the sequence of doors, and the mechanisms that allowed external control were discussed not as temporary improvisations, but as evidence of preparation. The court paid close attention to these details, recognizing that they shaped the essential question of intent. When Joseph addressed the court, his statements were subdued and inconsistent. He expressed remorse at times, but his explanations rarely aligned with the documented evidence. Observers noted that his tone lacked the certainty that had once characterized his interactions with neighbors and officials. The contrast between his earlier confidence and his demeanor in the courtroom underscored the difference between private control and public accountability. The court's final deliberations focused on the connection between the evidence, the IB testimony, and the responsibilities of the accused. The judgment was delivered with the same measured cadence that had been present throughout the proceedings. Joseph was found guilty on the principal charges, including the unlawful deprivation of liberty and the sustained creation of an environment that endangered the physical and emotional well-being of others. He received a life sentence to be served in a secure facility designed for individuals requiring long-term supervision. The ruling did not erase the years that had passed, but it provided a definitive legal conclusion to a case that had begun nearly 25 years earlier with a simple missing person report. The trial marked the point at which the disappearance of Elizabeth Fritzl ceased to be an unresolved question. The legal process had provided the official determination that the earlier investigation had been unable to reach. What remained, however, lay outside the courtroom, in the long recovery of those who had lived in the basement, and in the broader reflection upon how such an event had gone undetected for so many years. When the courtroom doors finally closed, and the legal process reached its conclusion, the focus of the authorities shifted from prosecution to long-term support for the individuals who had lived for years without access to the outside world. Elizabeth and her children were relocated immediately to a protected residence under medical supervision, a place designed to provide structure without introducing overwhelming change. The transition from an isolated underground environment to open space, even within a secured facility, required careful planning. Doctors, psychologists, and social workers collaborated to create a gradual program to help them adjust to daylight, fresh air, and normal patterns of daily life. These steps were taken not only for their physical well-being, but also for their sense of orientation. as simple experiences taken for granted by most people could be unfamiliar to those who had spent entire lifetimes in confinement. Elizabeth, who had entered the basement as a teenager and left it as a woman in her 40s, approached this new life with measured steadiness. She cooperated with medical teams, responded calmly to structured routines, and focused primarily on the needs of her children. Her statements, given in the months after the trial, reflected a practical mindset rather than an emotional one. She did not speak publicly about the past, nor did she show interest in revisiting it beyond the requirements of legal procedures. Her priority remained to provide stability for her children, who faced the challenge of learning concepts that others usually encounter much earlier in life. These included simple interactions, changing environments, and the rhythms of days and seasons, elements that had not existed in the controlled underground space. The children's adjustment progressed at different rates. Some adapted quickly to open areas and natural light. Others moved cautiously, taking small steps toward activities that felt unfamiliar. Their education began with basic lessons tailored to their needs, emphasizing orientation, communication, and gradual exposure to the external world. Specialists noted that their transitions reflected resilience, although they acknowledged that full adaptation would require years of continued support. Despite the difficulties, the environment provided at the protected residence was stable, quiet, and consistent, intended to encourage a sense of safety that had been absent for most of their lives. For Elizabeth's family members outside the protected environment, the revelation of what had occurred beneath their home required its own form of adjustment. Rosemarie, who had lived in the same building without knowledge of the basement's true purpose, found herself facing questions that had no straightforward answers. She cooperated fully with authorities, but chose to distance herself from the public once the trial ended. Her quiet movements through the months following the verdict reflected the weight of learning that the absence she had interpreted as voluntary had concealed a completely different reality. There were no public statements from her, and the records suggest she focused primarily on processing the information privately rather than addressing it openly. The town of Amstetten reacted in a similarly subdued manner. In the first months after the trial, there was significant attention from outside observers, but once the immediate developments passed, the community returned to its usual routines. Local residents did not dwell on the case in public, yet its memory remained present in quieter conversations. For some, the most lasting impression was the realization that a situation of such magnitude could exist hidden in a familiar neighborhood. For others, the case raised broader questions about social responsibility and the limits of what people notice in their everyday surroundings. These reflections did not change the past, but became part of the town's collective understanding of how events can unfold unnoticed over long periods. For law enforcement, the case became a point of study regarding missing person investigations, particularly those involving adults who appear to leave voluntarily. Officers reviewing the file years later noted how the lack of conflict, the absence of witnesses, and the misleading correspondence had influenced the assumptions made in 1984. The case illustrated the difficulty of detecting concealed environments and the challenges in balancing limited evidence with procedural expectations. It underscored the need for ongoing review of long-standing cases and prompted internal discussions about updating protocols. Though these changes could not alter the events that had already occurred, they contributed to incremental improvements in how similar cases might be handled in the future. Joseph, serving a life sentence, remained in a facility designated for long-term supervision. Reports from the years after the trial indicated that his health declined steadily and that he lived within a structured routine similar to others housed under comparable conditions. Conversations with him were limited to required assessments, and he did not publicly address the case again. The details of his daily life became a matter of institutional record rather than public interest, and over time his presence faded from the broader narrative as the focus shifted toward the recovery of those who had been affected. Elizabeth and her children continued to rebuild their lives in privacy. Their names were changed, and their location was kept confidential to protect them from attention. Over time, they developed patterns of daily activity that reflected increasing comfort with the outside world. These included simple walks, supervised outings, and interactions with trusted staff. Though their future required careful planning, their progress demonstrated that adaptation was possible even after years without exposure to ordinary surroundings. Their lives did not return to what they might have been, but they moved steadily toward a form of normalcy shaped by their own pace and needs. Long after the public discussion surrounding the case had diminished, a small detail remained in the protected residence where Elizabeth and her children stayed. Near a window that overlooked a quiet garden, someone had placed a potted plant. Nothing remarkable in appearance, just a simple green stem growing steadily under natural light. Staff later noted that Elizabeth often paused near it when guiding her children through their daily routines. For her, the presence of something growing freely in sunlight had a meaning that required no explanation. It was a quiet reminder that life continued beyond the boundaries of the years she had spent underground, and that even the smallest elements of the outside world could become symbols of the future she was trying to build. If you followed this account, share where you're watching from and which case you want examined next. Your comments help guide future investigations told in this steady, factual voice. Remember to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss a detailed reconstruction of these complex, long-buried stories.